On November 17, 2012, Salvador Alvarenga, a 37-year-old fisherman from El Salvador, stood on the shores of Costa Azul, Mexico, preparing for what he believed would be a routine fishing trip. He was a man shaped by the sea, an experienced hunter of sharks and tuna, who had spent years navigating the Pacific's unpredictable moods. He needed money, and a single successful haul could sustain him for weeks. That morning, however, the local port authorities had issued storm warnings and raised a red flag. Weather systems were converging offshore, and conditions were expected to deteriorate rapidly. Alvarenga assessed the forecast, weighed his options, and made the decision to go anyway. Experience had taught him to read the ocean's rhythms, and he believed he could outrun the storm. His vessel was a ponga, a 25-foot fiberglass skiff with an open deck, no cabin, and no shelter from the elements. It was designed for short trips in calm waters, not for extended voyages or rough seas. His companion for the trip was Ezequiel Cordoba, a 22-year-old who had little experience at sea, but needed work and was eager for the pay. They loaded over 1,000 pounds of gear onto the boat, including nets, lines, hooks, and a massive icebox that Alvarenga hoped would soon be filled with silver and gold in the form of fish. They pushed off from shore and headed 75 miles into the deep blue of the Pacific, where the big catches lived. As they moved farther from land, the atmosphere began to change. By late evening, the wind freshened, and the first signs of the storm reached them. The swells grew taller, and the boat began to pitch. At 1 in the morning, the first real wave struck. The ponga lurched violently, and water surged over the sides. Cordoba, gripping the edge of the boat with white knuckles, begged Alvarenga to turn back, to prevent the vessel from capsizing under the weight of the nets and gear. Alvarenga made a difficult choice. He cut his monofilament lines, watching thousands of dollars worth of equipment and catch vanish into the water below. He spun the bow toward the coast, aiming for the safety of the port of Chaco. They were 15 miles from land when the outboard engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Alvarenga pulled the starting cord once, twice, 3 times. On the final attempt, he yanked it so hard that the cable snapped clean off in his hand. The engine went silent. Without power, the ponga began to drift, wallowing in the waves and rolling from side to side like a piece of driftwood. They were now at the mercy of a current that led only one direction, away from everything they knew. For 5 endless days, the storm drove them farther out to sea, past the horizon and into the vastness of the Pacific. Rain lashed the deck. Waves battered the hull. The sky was dark, and the wind howled without pause. By the time the weather finally relented, they were nearly 300 miles offshore. Their boat rode so low in the water that it would have been invisible to any vessel more than half a mile away. They were specks in an indifferent ocean. Cordoba, shaking and exhausted, muttered that they were going to die. Alvarenga told him not to say that. He insisted that a rescue team would find them. He did not entirely believe it, but he could not allow despair to take hold so early. They had no flares, no working radio, and no way to signal for help. The sun seared them during the day, turning their skin dark and blistered. The nights were cold, cutting through their damp clothes and chilling them to the bone. Their only refuge was the icebox, where they curled together for warmth in a space barely large enough for 2 men. Hunger and thirst gnawed at them until their bodies felt hollowed out. On the 4th day without water, rain finally came. They stripped off their clothes and lifted their faces to the sky, drinking greedily as fresh water cascaded down. They caught what they could in stray bottles scavenged from debris floating in the waves. If they rationed it carefully, it might last a week. By the 11th day, desperation forced them to adapt. A sea turtle, disoriented in the darkness, struck the hull with a dull thud. Alvarenga dragged it aboard, relieved and almost giddy at the prospect of food. Its flesh gave them something to eat, and its blood, thick and warm, quenched their thirst. Alvarenga began hunting constantly after that, scanning the waters for more of these armored lifelines. He understood that survival depended on maintaining a steady supply of protein and liquid. Cordoba, however, resisted. He gagged at the taste of blood and picked reluctantly at the raw meat. Alvarenga tried to make it more tolerable, slicing the flesh into thin strips, seasoning it with seawater, and drying it in the sun on the casing of the dead motor. He served it on the turtle shell like a crude platter. It kept them alive, but only barely. Hunger became a constant presence, an ache that never fully subsided. Cordoba began to hallucinate, his mind conjuring images of orchards heavy with fruit. He begged Alvarenga for an orange, something to ease the craving. Alvarenga, understanding that reality offered no comfort, invented a small fiction. He pretended to make a trip to a store, then returned to say it was closed. Somehow, this lie comforted Cordoba enough that he drifted into sleep. The weeks bled into months, and their survival became less about food and more about willpower. Every dawn presented the same question. Could they endure another day in a sea with no end? A fragile routine began to take shape. Every morning at 5, Alvarenga climbed out of the icebox and sat on the deck facing east. The sunrise became his one fixed point. A burning line of light that promised land still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. His first task was always to check the crude traps he had fashioned from scavenged materials. Some mornings they held a scrap of fish or a small bird. Other mornings they were empty. Whatever the catch, he waited for Cordoba to wake before dividing it. Fairness mattered, even out there. Most of the day was spent buried in the icebox, conserving strength in that coffin-like space, where the heat was slightly more tolerable. An odd, boyish bond formed between them, despite the circumstances. At night, they lay on the open deck with their faces turned upward, tracing constellations and inventing patterns in the stars. It was a game they played to trick themselves into believing they were not entirely alone. On a night they guessed was Christmas Eve, the fragile balance shifted. Cordoba doubled over, clutching his stomach in pain. He had eaten part of a seabird earlier in the day. When they cut it open to inspect it, they found a snake curled inside its stomach, still intact. Cordoba survived the poisoning, but the experience left him shaken. Afterward, he could hardly bring himself to eat. The idea of consuming another raw bird revolted him. He began withdrawing into himself, drifting further from their shared meals and conversations. Weeks passed, and Cordoba's body began to fail. His arms shrank to the diameter of sticks. His thighs became no thicker than forearms. His ribs pressed sharply against his skin. He told Alvarenga that it was better to die than to continue enduring the hunger. One afternoon, Cordoba said goodbye and tried to throw himself into the sea. Alvarenga lunged across the deck and tackled him, dragging him back and shoving him into the icebox. He slammed the lid shut and sat on top of it, his weight pressing down as Cordoba struggled below. Alvarenga begged him to stop, to hold on long enough for them to tell their story, to make it home and see their families again. When Cordoba finally stopped fighting, Alvarenga lifted the lid and climbed in beside him, still pleading. But despair had already done its work. A few days later, Cordoba told Alvarenga quietly that he was going to die. Alvarenga tried to force water into his mouth, begging him not to leave him alone out there. It made no difference. Moments later, Cordoba was gone. Alvarenga propped the body upright on the bench to keep it from sliding overboard. The next morning, he emerged from the icebox and found his dead companion seated there, the sun on his face, as if he were simply resting. In his grief, Alvarenga began to speak to him, asking questions and pretending to hear answers. For 6 days, he kept the body on the boat. Pretending Cordoba was still alive was easier than accepting the truth. Finally, on the 6th day, he let the body slip into the water. He watched it sink beneath the surface, then retreated into the icebox and wept. Alone now, adrift somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific, Alvarenga turned survival into his only distraction. He hunted constantly, refining his techniques and learning which birds were safe to eat and which carried parasites. He invented a crude shark warning system. He would toss scraps of bird meat overboard and watch the water for movement. If nothing surfaced after a few minutes, he would risk a brief swim, short, terrifying plunges into the ocean that he imagined were visits to a beach with friends waiting for him on shore. These mental exercises became essential. Without them, the isolation threatened to collapse his mind entirely. His thoughts turned increasingly inward. He pictured his daughter, Fatima, whom he had not seen in years. In his dreams, her voice was a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge. He began constructing a future in his mind. A small house surrounded by fields, children running through the grass, animals grazing nearby. He prayed for one more chance to make it real, to return and become the father he had failed to be. These visions, fragile and half-formed, gave him something to hold on to, and the weight of solitude became unbearable. After 8 months at sea, a container ship appeared on the horizon. It was massive and purposeful, cutting a deliberate path across the water. For a moment, Alvarenga thought it might run him down. As it drew closer, he could see 3 men standing at the stern with fishing lines in their hands. He screamed and waved frantically, jumping up and down on the deck. They looked up. They saw him. They even waved back, casual and unbothered. But no one came. No lifeboat was lowered. No voice called out across the water. The ship slid past and disappeared beyond the horizon. When it was gone, something inside Alvarenga went quiet. His body slowed, his hunger dulled. His hunger, the same numb apathy that had swallowed Cordoba, began to seep into his own bones. He drifted through his 11th month at sea, having traveled more than 5,000 miles at a pace of less than 1 mile per hour. He was reduced to little more than rags and skin. A sweatshirt that had belonged to Cordoba shielded him from the sun. Below the waist, he wore only torn underwear and a single stray sneaker he had pulled from the water weeks earlier. His hair had grown into a tangled copper mass, and his thick, wild beard obscured most of his face. He weighed less than 100 pounds.
Why?
More and more, he turned to questions he could not answer.
Why are you doing this to me?
Was he alive by accident or by design? Some days, he wondered if his ordeal carried a message, a testament to endurance that he was meant to deliver. Other times, he suspected it was punishment for choices he could no longer remember making. Perhaps the only reason he still drew breath was to carry forward the memory of Cordoba, to ensure that his companion's death was not forgotten. On January 30th, 2014, 14 months after the storm had begun, the ocean finally broke its silence. Alvarenga spotted coconuts floating in the swells. Above him, seabirds wheeled in dense, noisy flocks. Then, through sheets of cold rain, a strip of land emerged on the horizon. Low, green, and wild. He paddled toward it cautiously, wary of sharks lurking in the shallows. It took half a day of effort to close the distance. At 10 yards out, he leapt into the surf and let the waves carry him in. He collapsed on the sand, gripping it in both hands like a prize, like proof that solid ground still existed. 2 islanders found him shortly after. He had landed on Ebon Atoll, a remote speck at the southern edge of the Marshall Islands. If he had missed it, the next possible refuge was the Philippines, more than 3,000 miles farther west. The islanders brought him food and water, but his body could not tolerate it. His digestive system, adapted to a narrow diet of raw fish and seabird, rejected the sudden abundance. Doctors who examined him determined he had severe anemia and parasites from the uncooked flesh he had consumed for more than a year. He could not sleep. His body, trained by months of hypervigilance, refused rest. Worse than the physical damage was the psychological burden. The memory of Cordoba remained with him, vivid and unshakable, even on solid ground. 11 days later, Alvarenga was strong enough to fly home to El Salvador. When he saw his daughter, Fatima, he clutched her tightly and whispered apologies for all the years he had lost. She held him and told him it was enough that he had returned. But life on land offered no easy resolution.
You're safe now.
For months, Alvarenga lived in a state of shock. He could not look at water without his chest tightening. He slept with the lights on and refused to be alone in a room. The habits forged by survival, constant vigilance, distrust of stillness, the expectation of death around every corner, stayed with him long after the ocean had released him. It was nearly a year before he could begin to process what had happened. Only then, sitting with researchers and studying maps of his drift across the Pacific, did the full scale of his ordeal come into focus. 438 days at sea, more than 5,000 miles traveled. Before Alvarenga, the longest recorded survival adrift was 133 days, endured by Poon Lim, a Chinese sailor during World War II. Most shipwreck survivors die within 7 to 10 days from dehydration, exposure, or starvation. The human body typically cannot sustain itself on a diet of raw fish and seabird for more than a few weeks without succumbing to malnutrition or disease. By all known medical parameters, Alvarenga's survival should have been impossible. Physiologically, his body had undergone extreme adaptation. Over the course of 14 months, his system cannibalized its own muscle tissue to keep his vital organs functioning. He survived on a caloric intake that was a fraction of what a human being needs to remain upright and conscious. His liver processed toxins from raw meat that would have poisoned most people within days. His mind, isolated from all human contact, developed coping mechanisms that allowed him to maintain a sense of self despite the crushing weight of solitude. But more than the physical transformation, it was the daily management of his spirit that brought him home. He refused to let the silence of the ocean become his own silence. He spoke to the wind, to the birds, and to the ghost of his companion to keep the sound of a human voice alive in his ears. He invented routines, marked time, and imposed structure on a world that offered none. Salvador Alvarenga did not survive the Pacific through heroism or luck. He survived through repetition, waking each morning when sleep would have been easier, hunting when starvation beckoned, speaking when silence would have been final. He returned to land weighing barely 100 pounds. Haunted by the memory of a companion he could not save and reshaped by an ocean that had transformed him into something operating beyond normal human limits. His body bore the scars of his journey, skin darkened and thickened by the sun, muscles wasted to nothing, a digestive system that would take years to recover. His daughter asked him once why he had not given up. He told her he did not know. Perhaps survival, in its rawest form, is not about choosing to live, but about refusing to choose death. For 438 days, in a boat no larger than a bedroom, Salvador Alvarenga made that refusal over and over again. Each morning he woke. Each day he hunted. Each night he lay beneath the stars and reminded himself that he was still human. That repetition, sustained without witnesses and without certainty, remains one of the most extreme acts of endurance ever documented. His story offers no easy lessons and no comfortable conclusions. It is simply the record of a man who drifted farther and longer than anyone before him and somehow, against every expectation, found his way back.